It's 8:21 in St. Louis. Tony Messenger in for McGraw Millhaven back here on the Big 550 KTRS. Interesting story in BuzzFeed yesterday about the headline was The Donald and the Dictator. Donald Trump likes to brag about his foreign policy chops often by saying things like, hey, I went to Russia and met Putin once. I was at the Miss Universe pageant, and therefore I know about whatever country it was in. Well, he once tried to rent some property he owns in New York to former Libyan dictator Muammar Qaddafi, a well-known supporter of terrorism. And BuzzFeed's Dan Wagner has the story that apparently it was more than just trying to rent some property to Qaddafi, but he was also trying to do business with the dictator. Dan Wagner, you're on the Big 550 KTRS. How are you today?
Doing great. Thanks so much for asking.
So tell us what you found. What were Donald Trump's connections to Muammar Qaddafi, the dictator?
So this is really interesting. A lot of people had known about this issue of the rental. This was a big deal at the time. Gaddafi had given this high-profile speech to the UN and made fun of George W. Bush and so on. And I guess a lot of people thought that, Trump had come out and said this was an accident and done through intermediaries, and he had no idea. That was pretty much the end of it at the time. But what we learned once we started digging into it was that Trump had already been pursuing business with Gaddafi from Libya's billions of dollars of oil wealth before he rented the property to Gaddafi. So it would be really a pretty amazing coincidence that this foreign leader, who the owner of this estate had been courting, just happened to have rented it also. So Trump had gone golfing with the Libyan ambassador already prior to that, and apparently had been making some other approaches. But once Trump rented the property to Gaddafi, he then called up some of these so-called intermediaries and said, "Hey, I'd like a meeting with the guy." And we don't have strong enough sourcing yet to report precisely what happened after that, so you'll have to look for future stories. But at least we've been able to report so far that Trump was, again, pursuing those billions of dollars in oil wealth that Gaddafi had strong control over at the time.
And one of the things that the story indicates that I find interesting, because Donald Trump consistently loves to brag about how wealthy he is, and yet there are a variety of stories for using public records to call into question what his actual wealth is, which is really kind of funny. It's sort of the opposite of what most presidential candidates do. But apparently he needed Gaddafi's billions because he didn't actually have relationships with the big banks.
Well, it's true that his personal financial disclosures indicate that he doesn't have direct lending relationships with any of the big U.S. banks. He works with a couple of smaller, sort of more like private equity shops, and he does have a relationship with Deutsche Bank, which is ongoing, although it's been pretty rocky and full of lawsuits over the years. But that's not really the same number of financiers that most real estate developers would be working with. Most of them would have some sort of relationship with, say, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Goldman Sachs, the big U.S. financiers. That's not the case with Trump, and that's one reason why we suggest in the story he may have been seeking money out of the sovereign wealth fund of a developing country.
Daniel Wagner with BuzzFeed. Daniel, where do you think this story goes next?
I think you're going to see a little bit more about places that Donald Trump tried to raise money, and maybe some of the people who he tried to do it from weren't that nice.
Hey, I appreciate you joining us. Thanks a lot.
Absolutely. Thank you.
You're listening to Tony Messenger on the Big 550 KTRS.